The security guard's grip on her arm was firm, deliberate, meant to be seen. Margaret felt every eye in the boutique turn toward her, the only black woman in a sea of designer suits and pearl necklaces. "Ma'am, you need to leave your bag at the front desk," he announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. She watched 5 white women walk past him freely, their purses swinging at their sides. No one stopped them. No one questioned them. But Margaret? She was different. And in that crystal chandelier palace of marble and privilege, being different meant being unwelcome. What Margaret didn't know as she stood there, humiliation burning through her chest, was that this moment would change everything. Not just for her, but for every person who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. And if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. The security guard's hand clamped down on Margaret's arm with unnecessary force. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave your bag at the front desk," he said, his voice loud enough to draw stares from every corner of the boutique. Margaret felt the heat rise to her cheeks as dozens of eyes turned toward her. She was the only black woman in the store. "I beg your pardon?" Margaret replied, keeping her voice steady despite the trembling she felt inside. She had taught high school English for 37 years, and she knew how to maintain composure under pressure. But this was different. This cut deeper. "Store policy," the guard said flatly, though Margaret had watched at least 5 other women walk past him in the last 10 minutes, their designer handbags swinging freely at their sides. White women. Wealthy women. Women who belonged, apparently, in a way that she did not. It was a Saturday afternoon in March, and Margaret had driven 2 hours from her small town to the city, specifically to visit Adelstein's, the most prestigious boutique on Fifth Avenue. She had saved for months, ever since her daughter Sarah had called with the news that she was getting married in June. Margaret wanted to find something special, something worthy of the occasion. Sarah was her only child, her pride and joy. And after raising her alone following her husband's death 20 years ago, Margaret wanted to look her absolute best on her daughter's wedding day. The boutique was everything the magazines had promised. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, casting prismatic light across marble floors so polished they reflected like mirrors. Elegant mannequins posed in the windows, draped in silks and cashmeres that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly pension. The air itself seemed expensive, perfumed with something floral and French that made her think of gardens she'd only seen in paintings. But now, standing in the entrance with the security guard's fingers still pressed into her arm, and every face in the store turned toward her with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed disdain, Margaret felt like an intruder in a world that had never been meant for people like her. "I watched you let those other women in without saying a word," Margaret said quietly, gesturing toward the shopping floor where several customers browsed freely, their purses hanging from their shoulders or clutched in their hands. "Why am I different?" The guard's jaw tightened. He was young, probably not even 30, with the kind of squared shoulders and stiff posture that suggested he took his authority very seriously. Too seriously. "Ma'am, don't make this difficult. Either leave your bag or leave the store." A woman in a navy blue suit approached. Her name tag identified her as Patricia Chen, store manager. She wore pearls at her throat and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Is there a problem here?" "This customer is refusing to comply with our security procedures," the guard said. Patricia's gaze swept over Margaret, taking in her modest spring coat, her sensible shoes, the worn leather handbag that Margaret's mother had given her decades ago. Margaret saw the calculation happen in the woman's eyes, the instant assessment and dismissal. It was a look Margaret had seen before, throughout her life, though never quite so brazenly displayed. "I'm afraid Marcus is correct," Patricia said, her tone polite but firm. "We've had issues with theft recently, and we must ask all customers to check their personal bags. Surely you understand?" "All customers?" Margaret asked, her voice rising slightly despite her best efforts to remain calm. "Because I've been standing here for 5 minutes and I haven't seen you ask anyone else." Patricia's smile thinned. "Ma'am, if you're going to be difficult, I'll have to ask you to leave." Adelstein's has a certain standard to maintain, and we serve a very particular clientele. Perhaps you might find more suitable shopping at one of the department stores downtown." The words hung in the air like a slap. Margaret felt something crack inside her chest, not just anger but a deep, bone-weary sadness that came from being made to feel less than human. She had taught hundreds of students over her career, many of them children who started the year barely able to read and finished it with confidence and pride in their abilities. She had shaped young minds, inspired futures, changed lives. She had worked 2 jobs to put her daughter through college. She had buried her husband too young and raised Sarah alone, never once asking for help or complaining about the weight of it all. And now, in this gleaming palace of commerce, she was being told she didn't belong. "I have money to spend here," Margaret said, her voice quiet but clear. "I came to buy a dress for my daughter's wedding." "I'm sure you did," Patricia said, in a tone that suggested she believed nothing of the sort. She nodded to Marcus, who tightened his grip on Margaret's arm. "Marcus, please escort this woman out. She's disturbing our other customers." Margaret looked around the store. No one met her eyes. A woman in a fur stole turned away quickly. An elderly couple near the jewelry counter whispered to each other behind raised hands. A young sales associate standing by the evening gowns looked uncomfortable, but said nothing. She was alone. Marcus began steering her toward the door. Margaret's heart hammered in her chest, humiliation burning through her like fire. She wanted to resist, to demand they call the police to make them acknowledge what they were doing. But she was 63 years old, and she had learned long ago that sometimes dignity meant walking away with your head held high, even when everything in you screamed to fight. As Marcus pushed open the glass door and practically shoved her onto the sidewalk, Margaret turned back one last time. Patricia Chen stood in the entrance, arms crossed, watching to make sure she left. Their eyes met for just a moment. "You'll regret this," Margaret said softly. Patricia's laugh was cold. "I sincerely doubt that. Good day, ma'am." The door closed with a soft click that sounded to Margaret's ears like a judge's gavel falling. She stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, her hands shaking, her eyes burning with tears she refused to let fall. People rushed past her on both sides, absorbed in their own worlds, their own concerns. None of them had witnessed what happened inside. None of them knew that Margaret's heart was breaking, that something fundamental had been taken from her in that store. Finally, she turned and walked toward where she had parked her car, 3 blocks away. Each step felt heavier than the last. She had come to the city with such hope, such excitement. She had imagined herself in a beautiful dress, standing beside Sarah on her wedding day, pride and joy radiating from every pore. Now she felt small, diminished, stripped of something essential. When she reached her car, a 15-year-old Honda that had seen better days but still ran reliably, Margaret sat in the driver's seat and finally allowed herself to cry. She cried for the humiliation she had just endured. She cried for every time in her life she had been made to feel less than. She cried for her mother and grandmother and all the women who had come before her, women who had faced far worse and survived it with grace and strength. But most of all, she cried because she was tired. So very tired of having to prove her worth, her dignity, her right to simply exist in the world without being questioned or diminished or cast aside. After several minutes, Margaret wiped her eyes and pulled out her phone. She scrolled through her contacts until she found the name she was looking for, Gerald Thompson. She hadn't spoken to Gerald in almost 6 months, not since the Christmas party at her school where they had both been honored for their years of service. Gerald had retired from teaching the same year Margaret had, and they had kept in touch sporadically since then. But Gerald had also mentioned something at that party, something Margaret had filed away in her mind without giving it much thought at the time. He had told her he was starting a new position, consulting for some investment firm. He had given her his card and told her to call if she ever needed anything. Margaret hadn't planned to take him up on that offer. But now, sitting in her car with tears still wet on her cheeks, she found herself dialing his number. He answered on the 3rd ring. "Margaret Washington, as I live and breathe. To what do I owe this pleasure?" Despite everything, Margaret found herself smiling slightly at Gerald's warm, familiar voice. They had taught at neighboring schools for years and had always supported each other at teacher conferences and district meetings. Gerald was a good man, one of the few people in her life who had never treated her as anything less than an equal. "Gerald," she said, her voice still thick with emotion. "I need your help with something. It might sound crazy, but I need you to hear me out." Gerald listened without interrupting as Margaret told him everything that had happened at Adelstein's. When she finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Margaret wondered if she had made a mistake calling him, if her anger and hurt had led her to reach out for help that didn't exist or couldn't be given. "Margaret," Gerald finally said, his voice serious in a way she had rarely heard it. "What I'm about to tell you needs to stay between us for now. Can you promise me that?" "Of course," Margaret said, surprised by the shift in his tone. "The investment firm I work for, Blackstone Heritage Group, specializes in acquisitions of struggling luxury retail establishments. We identify stores that are failing financially, buy them, restructure them, and turn them profitable again. It's a very specific niche market." He paused. "Margaret, I've been watching Adelstein's for the past 3 months. Their numbers are terrible. They're hemorrhaging money. Their customer base is shrinking, and from what I can tell, their management is stuck in practices from 40 years ago. The only reason they're still standing is family money, and that's running out fast." Margaret's heart began to beat faster. "What are you saying, Gerald?" "I'm saying that Adelstein's is going to be forced to sell within the next 6 months, maybe sooner. The family patriarch, Edward Adelstein, is 87 years old and in poor health. His children have no interest in running the business, and the grandchildren are spread across Europe spending money faster than the store can make it. The company is drowning in debt." Gerald's voice softened. "Margaret, what happened to you today wasn't just wrong morally. It was bad business. Adelstein's is dying because they've refused to evolve, refused to welcome new customers, refused to see that the world has changed around them." Margaret gripped the phone tighter. An idea was forming in her mind, crazy and impossible and yet somehow perfect. "Gerald, how much would it cost to buy Adelstein's?" Another long pause. "Margaret, we're talking about millions of dollars." "I know that, but I also know that I have my pension, the money from selling David's life insurance policy, my savings, and the house. I own it outright. If I sold it, if I put everything on the line..." She took a deep breath. "How much, Gerald?" "The preliminary estimates put Adelstein's value at around $12 million, but given their debt situation, we could probably acquire it for $8 to $9 million. Maybe less if we negotiate well." He cleared his throat. "Margaret, this isn't like buying a car or a house. This is an enormous financial risk. If the turnaround doesn't work, you could lose everything. I've already lost something today, Gerald, something that money can't buy back." Margaret stared at the boutique's windows 3 blocks away, visible even from where she sat. "But maybe I can use money to make sure what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else. Tell me honestly, if I could come up with the money, would your firm help me? Would they even consider working with someone like me?" Gerald was quiet for so long that Margaret thought the call had dropped. Then he spoke, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "Margaret Washington, I have known you for 15 years. I watched you turn the worst-performing English department in the district into the best in the state. I saw you take kids who couldn't read and teach them to love Shakespeare. If anyone can pull off the impossible, it's you." His voice became businesslike. "But I need you to understand what you're getting into. This isn't just about revenge or proving a point. If you buy this store, you'll be responsible for 43 employees, lease agreements, supplier contracts, and a customer base that may not welcome the changes you'll need to make. Are you prepared for that?" Margaret thought about her empty house waiting for her back home. She thought about the long, quiet days of retirement that stretched ahead with nothing to fill them but gardening and book club meetings and visits with Sarah. She thought about the fire that had burned in her chest when she was teaching, the sense of purpose that made every early morning and late night worthwhile. Most of all, she thought about Patricia Chen's cold smile and the way Marcus had grabbed her arm, and the faces of all those customers who had looked away rather than speak up for what was right. "Yes," Margaret said firmly. "I'm prepared. Tell me what I need to do." Over the next 3 weeks, Margaret's life became a whirlwind of activity that made her teaching career seem relaxing by comparison. She met with Gerald's colleagues at Blackstone Heritage Group, a diverse team of financial experts who were initially skeptical of her involvement but slowly warmed to her determination and vision. She met with lawyers and accountants, learning a vocabulary of business terms that felt like a foreign language at first, but gradually became familiar. She put her house on the market, the home where she had raised Sarah and built a lifetime of memories. It sold in 5 days to a young couple expecting their first child. Margaret found herself crying as she packed up 30 years of her life into boxes. But they were different tears than the ones she had shed in her car outside Adelstein's. These tears had purpose behind them. She cashed out her pension, took a loan against her savings, and pulled together every dollar she could find. It wasn't enough. She was still $2 million short. That's when Sarah called. "Mom, Gerald called me," Sarah said, her voice tight with emotion. "He told me what you're trying to do. He said you sold the house. Mom, that was supposed to be my inheritance. That was supposed to be—" Her voice broke. "Why didn't you tell me?" Margaret sat down heavily in her half-empty living room, surrounded by boxes and the ghosts of her former life. "Honey, I didn't want to worry you. You have the wedding to plan, your career to focus on." "Mom, stop." Sarah's voice was firm now, the tone she used in her job as a hospital administrator, the voice of someone who made difficult decisions every day. "I want to help. James and I want to help." "Sarah, no, this is my fight." "It's not just your fight, Mom. It's everyone's fight who has ever been made to feel like they don't belong somewhere. Do you know how many times I've walked into a meeting and been mistaken for someone's assistant? How many times I've had to prove myself twice as hard because people took one look at me and made assumptions?" Sarah's voice softened. "You raised me to stand up for what's right. You taught me that sometimes you have to take risks to make change happen. Let me be part of this. Let me help you." Margaret closed her eyes, overwhelmed by love and gratitude and a fierce pride in the woman her daughter had become. "Sarah, James and I have been saving for a house. We have $400,000. It's yours. And before you argue, I already talked to him about it and he agrees. We'll rent for a few more years, a house can wait." "This can't." "That's still not enough," Margaret said, but her voice was wavering. "I know. But I also know you've been helping Aunt Joyce with her medical bills for the past 5 years. I know you've been sending money to the scholarship fund at your old school. I know you gave most of Dad's insurance money to his sister when she lost her job." Sarah paused. "Mom, you've spent your whole life giving to other people. Let people give back to you for once. Let me make some calls." Over the next week, something remarkable happened. Sarah contacted old students of Margaret's, people whose lives she had touched over her 37 years of teaching. She created a crowdfunding campaign, explaining what Margaret was trying to do and why it mattered. She reached out to the teachers' union, to community organizations, to the NLACP chapter in their county. The response was overwhelming. Former students sent $50, $100, whatever they could spare. Some sent more. A lawyer Margaret had taught in 10th grade sent $10,000 with a note that said, "You taught me to read when everyone else had given up on me. This is the least I can do." A woman who had been in Margaret's very first class sent $5,000 and wrote, "You changed my life. Let me help you change the world." The teachers' union contributed $50,000. A civil rights organization sent $100,000. Small donations poured in from across the country as the story spread on social media. $5 here, $20 there. Each one a small voice saying that what happened to Margaret mattered, that discrimination and prejudice had no place in the modern world. That change was possible if enough people stood together. 3 weeks after Margaret's phone call to Gerald, Blackstone Heritage Group made an official offer to purchase Adelstein's for $7.8 million. The Adelstein family, desperate and out of options, accepted. Margaret stood in Gerald's office looking at the contract that would change her life forever. She held a pen in her hand, and her fingers trembled slightly. This was it. The point of no return. Once she signed, she would own Adelstein's. She would be responsible for its success or failure. She would be gambling everything on a dream that might turn into a nightmare. "You don't have to do this," Gerald said gently. "Even now you could walk away. We could find another buyer. You could take your money and buy a nice condo somewhere, travel the world, enjoy your retirement." Margaret thought about Patricia Chen's dismissive smile. She thought about Marcus's hand on her arm. She thought about all the people who had given their hard-earned money to make this moment possible, people who believed in her and in the possibility of change. She thought about the young Margaret, growing up in Mississippi in the 1960s, watching her parents denied service at restaurants, forced to use separate bathrooms, treated as less than human. She thought about the progress that had been made and the work that still needed to be done. "No," Margaret said, her voice steady and sure. "I'm doing this." She signed her name at the bottom of the contract with a flourish. Margaret Elizabeth Washington, owner and CEO, Adelstein's Boutique. Gerald smiled and shook her hand. "Congratulations, Margaret. Now comes the hard part." "What's that?" "Making it work." Margaret chose a Monday morning for her return to Adelstein's. She wanted the staff present, the store operational, everything exactly as it had been the day she was thrown out. She dressed carefully that morning in a navy blue suit that Sarah had helped her pick out, modest pearl earrings that had belonged to her mother, and comfortable but elegant shoes. She looked at herself in the mirror of her temporary apartment and barely recognized the woman staring back, not because she looked different, but because she felt different. There was a steel in her spine now, a fire in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Gerald met her outside the boutique at 8:30, half an hour before opening. He carried a leather briefcase and wore the same confident smile he'd had when they were teachers together, the one that said everything would work out fine, even when it seemed impossible. "Ready?" he asked. Margaret took a deep breath and looked at the gleaming windows, the gold lettering that spelled out Adelstein's in elegant script, the doorway through which she had been pushed just 6 weeks earlier. "Ready?" They walked through the front door together. The early morning staff was preparing for the day, straightening displays, dusting counters, checking inventory. Margaret recognized several faces from her previous visit. A young sales associate named Jennifer looked up from arranging silk scarves and smiled politely, clearly not recognizing her. Marcus stood at his usual post by the entrance, his security guard uniform pressed and perfect. He glanced at Margaret with no sign of recognition, then did a double take when he saw Gerald's expensive suit and briefcase. His posture straightened slightly, the automatic deference to wealth and power that Margaret had witnessed so many times before. "I'm sorry, sir, but the store doesn't open until 9, Marcus said to Gerald, his tone respectful in a way it had never been with Margaret. "That's quite all right," Gerald replied smoothly. "We're not here to shop. We're here to meet with the staff. Could you please gather everyone in the main showroom? This will only take a few minutes." Marcus hesitated, confusion crossing his face. "I don't know if I have the authority to—" "You don't," Margaret said quietly, speaking for the first time. "But I do." Marcus's eyes swiveled to her, and she watched as recognition slowly dawned. His face went pale, then flushed red. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. "Please gather the staff," Margaret repeated, her voice calm and measured. "Everyone, including Patricia Chen." It took 15 minutes for all 43 employees to assemble. They stood in small clusters throughout the showroom, whispering to each other, confusion and anxiety written on their faces. Patricia Chen arrived last, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor. She wore another impeccable suit, her pearls gleaming at her throat, her expression one of irritated impatience. "What's this about?" Patricia demanded, looking at Gerald. "I have a store to run and we open in 20 minutes. I don't appreciate having my morning disrupted by—" Her eyes landed on Margaret, and she stopped mid-sentence. "You. What are you doing here?" "Marcus, I thought I made it clear that this woman was not to be allowed back in the store." "Ms. Chen," Gerald said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Allow me to introduce Margaret Washington. As of 9 o'clock this morning, she is the owner and CEO of Adelstein's Boutique." The silence that followed was absolute. Margaret could have heard a pin drop on the marble floor. Every face turned toward her with identical expressions of shock. Patricia Chen's mouth fell open. Marcus looked like he might be sick. Margaret stepped forward, her sensible shoes making soft sounds on the polished floor. She looked at each person in turn, meeting their eyes, seeing the confusion and fear and uncertainty written there. Most of them had no idea what had happened 6 weeks ago. They were just people trying to do their jobs, trying to pay their bills, trying to get through another day. They didn't deserve to suffer for Patricia's prejudice or Marcus's complicity. But Patricia and Marcus were different. 6 weeks ago, Margaret began, her voice carrying clearly through the showroom. I came to this store to shop for a dress for my daughter's wedding. I had saved money for months. I was excited and hopeful. But I was treated very differently than other customers. I was singled out, humiliated, and ultimately thrown out of the store by security. She looked at Patricia. I was told that I didn't meet the standard for Adelstein's clientele. I was made to feel like I didn't belong in a place where I had every right to be. She paused, letting her words sink in. Several employees shifted uncomfortably. Jennifer, the young sales associate, looked horrified. An older woman near the jewelry counter had tears in her eyes. I could have walked away, Margaret continued. I could have accepted that humiliation and moved on with my life. But instead, I decided to do something about it. With the help of friends, family, former students, and people across this country who believe that discrimination has no place in our society, I raised the money to buy this store, not for revenge, not to punish anyone, but to make sure that what happened to me never happens to anyone else within these walls. She turned to Patricia Chen, whose face had gone from red to white and back to red again. Ms. Chen, I want to thank you for teaching me an important lesson. You showed me exactly what's wrong with businesses like this one. Businesses that confuse exclusivity with exclusion, that mistake discrimination for discernment. You also showed me that sometimes the only way to change a broken system is to take control of it yourself. Patricia's hands were clenched into fists at her sides. This is ridiculous. You can't just come in here and— I can, actually, Margaret said calmly. I own this store, everything in it, including the employment contracts of everyone standing in this room. She pulled a folder from her bag and handed it to Patricia. You're fired, Ms. Chen. Effective immediately. You'll find severance details in this packet, along with information about final paychecks and benefits. I suggest you clean out your office and leave within the hour. Patricia snatched the folder, her hands shaking. You'll regret this. I'll sue you for wrongful termination. You'll find that everything is completely legal and above board, Gerald interjected smoothly. Ms. Washington has grounds for termination based on discriminatory practices that put this company at legal risk. If you'd like to pursue legal action, that's certainly your right. But I should warn you that we have multiple witnesses to the incident 6 weeks ago, security footage from the store, and a very compelling case for a hostile work environment. We would be happy to see you in court. Patricia's face crumpled. For just a moment, Margaret saw past the polished exterior to something underneath. Fear, shame, the sudden recognition of consequences that had seemed impossible just minutes before. But the moment passed and Patricia's expression hardened into cold fury. You people, she hissed, the words dripping with venom. You're all the same. Always playing the victim, always demanding special treatment. That's enough, Margaret said, her voice sharp as broken glass. Leave now, Ms. Chen. Don't make this uglier than it needs to be. Patricia turned on her heel and stalked toward the offices at the back of the store, her heels clicking like gunshots. The door slammed behind her with enough force to rattle the chandeliers. Margaret turned to Marcus, who looked like he wanted the marble floor to open up and swallow him. He was young, she reminded herself. Young and probably just following orders, doing what he thought was expected of him. She thought about the hundreds of young people she had taught over the years, kids who had made mistakes and learned from them, who had grown into better versions of themselves when given the chance. Marcus, she said, her voice gentler now, what you did to me 6 weeks ago was wrong. You know that, don't you? He nodded miserably, unable to meet her eyes. Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry. I was just doing what Ms. Chen told me to do, but that's no excuse. I should have spoken up. I should have. His voice trailed off. Yes, you should have, Margaret agreed. But I'm going to give you a choice, Marcus. You can leave today with a severance package, or you can stay and learn to do better. If you stay, you'll go through mandatory training on bias and discrimination. You'll learn that security doesn't mean making assumptions about people based on how they look. You'll learn that everyone who walks through that door deserves respect and dignity. Can you do that? Marcus looked up at her, surprise and gratitude warring on his young face. Yes, ma'am, I can. I will. Thank you for... His voice cracked. Thank you for giving me a second chance. Margaret nodded. Don't waste it. She turned to address the rest of the staff, who had watched the entire scene unfold with various expressions of shock, relief, and uncertainty. I know this is overwhelming. Change always is. But I want you to understand my vision for Adelstein's. This store has a proud history, but that history has to evolve. We will no longer be a place that serves only a certain type of customer. We will be a place that welcomes everyone with money to spend and respect to give. Luxury isn't about exclusion, it's about quality, service, and making every customer feel valued. Jennifer, the young sales associate, raised her hand tentatively. Ms. Washington, I just want to say, what happened to you was terrible. I was here that day and I didn't speak up, and I've regretted it every day since. I'm glad you bought the store. I'm glad you're here. Several other employees nodded in agreement. The older woman near the jewelry counter spoke up, her voice trembling slightly. My name is Helen Rodriguez. I've worked here for 19 years. I've watched this store change over time, and not always for the better. I think maybe this is exactly what Adelstein's needs. Someone who understands that dignity matters more than designer labels. Margaret felt warmth spread through her chest. Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Jennifer. I'm going to need all of you to help make this work. This won't be easy. We have a lot of changes to make, and not everyone will be happy about them. But if we work together, if we commit to treating every customer with respect and every employee with fairness, I believe we can turn this store into something truly special. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of meetings and paperwork. Margaret met with department heads, reviewed inventory and sales figures, and began the process of understanding exactly what she had bought. The numbers were worse than she had imagined. Adelstein's was losing money in almost every category. Customer traffic was down 40% from the previous year. Online sales were virtually non-existent. The store was, as Gerald had warned, on the verge of collapse. But as Margaret walked through the showrooms, examining the merchandise and talking with employees, she began to see possibilities. The bones of the business were good: high-quality products, a prestigious location, a staff that was skilled if demoralized. What had been lacking was vision and values, a sense of purpose beyond simply making money. That afternoon, Margaret held her first official meeting with the senior staff who remained after Patricia's departure. She outlined her plans: expanding the customer base, creating a more welcoming atmosphere, hiring diverse staff, implementing anti-discrimination training, launching an online presence, and most importantly, changing the culture from the ground up. I won't lie to you, she told them. The next 6 months will be brutal. We have a lot of work to do and not a lot of time to do it. But I believe in this store. I believe in what it can become. More importantly, I believe in all of you. You wouldn't be here if you didn't care about quality and service. Now I'm asking you to expand that care to include everyone who walks through our doors. Helen Rodriguez, who Margaret had promoted to interim manager that morning, spoke up. What about the old customers, the ones who liked things the way they were? They're going to be upset about the changes. Let them be upset, Margaret said firmly. Any customer who stops shopping here because we've decided to treat all people with dignity is not a customer we need. We'll find new customers, better customers, people who share our values. Trust me on this. As the meeting broke up and staff returned to their duties, Gerald pulled Margaret aside. You did well today. Really well. But you know the hard part is just beginning, right? I know, Margaret said. But Gerald, did you see their faces? Most of them want this. They want to be part of something better. That's what's going to make this work. I hope you're right, Gerald said, because if you're not, you're going to lose everything. Margaret looked around the store, her store now, and thought about the journey that had brought her here. From humiliation to ownership, from victim to leader, from retirement to the biggest challenge of her life. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Then I'd better not be wrong, she said. The first month was harder than Margaret had imagined possible. She woke at 5 every morning and often didn't leave the store until 9 at night. Her temporary apartment became little more than a place to sleep and shower. Sarah called every evening to check on her, worry evident in her voice, but Margaret reassured her daughter that she was fine, that everything was going according to plan. It wasn't entirely true. The old guard customers, the ones who had shopped at Adelstein's for decades, began staying away in droves. They didn't like the new welcome signs Margaret had installed at the entrance. They didn't like the diverse faces she had hired to work the floor. They especially didn't like that Margaret had instituted a strict no-tolerance policy for any discriminatory behavior, which meant that when Mrs. Vanderbilt complained loudly about having to wait in line behind those people, Helen Rodriguez politely but firmly asked her to leave and not return. Mrs. Vanderbilt had been shopping at Adelstein since 1973. Her departure made the society pages. The negative press started immediately. Historic boutique abandons legacy customers, read one headline. New owner drives away prestigious clientele, proclaimed another. A fashion blogger with 2 million followers wrote a scathing piece titled, "The Death of Elegance, How Political Correctness Killed Adelsteins." Margaret read every word, felt every blow, but refused to back down. She had expected resistance. What she hadn't expected was how personal it would feel, how each negative review seemed designed to cut directly to her deepest insecurities. But she wasn't alone. The new customers started arriving in the second week. They came tentatively at first, drawn by news stories about the ownership change and curious to see if the promises were real. Margaret made it a point to be on the floor as much as possible, greeting customers personally, asking about their needs, treating every person who walked through the door as if they were royalty. A young professional named Aisha came in looking for an interview suit. She confessed to Helen that she'd never shopped anywhere this nice before, that she was nervous about the prices and worried about being judged. Helen spent 2 hours with her, finding pieces that fit both her budget and her style, treating her with the same care and attention that had once been reserved only for society matrons spending tens of thousands of dollars. Aisha left with a beautiful suit, tears in her eyes, and posted about the experience on social media. The post went viral. Suddenly, Adelstein's wasn't just a story about discrimination and redemption. It was becoming a symbol of something larger, a place where everyone truly was welcome. The tide began to turn. New customers arrived in increasing numbers. Young professionals, families, women of color who had never dreamed of shopping in a place like Adelstein's. They came because they'd heard the stories, because they wanted to support a business that stood for something, because Margaret had created a space where they felt valued. Sales didn't immediately skyrocket, but they stabilized. More importantly, customer satisfaction scores climbed higher than they'd been in a decade. The staff, energized by the changes and proud to work somewhere that reflected their values, began providing service that went beyond mere professionalism into genuine care. Marcus transformed before Margaret's eyes. The cocky young security guard disappeared, replaced by someone thoughtful and aware. He took his training seriously, asked questions, admitted when he didn't understand something. One afternoon, Margaret watched him help an elderly woman with a walker navigate the entrance, holding doors and offering his arm with gentle respect. When he caught Margaret watching, he smiled shyly. "Thank you again for the second chance, Ms. Washington," he said. "I won't let you down." "You haven't," Margaret replied. "Keep it up." But not everything was going smoothly. The store's financial situation remained precarious. Margaret had invested everything she had, and the transitional period was expensive. New hiring, training programs, updated technology for online sales, renovations to make the store more accessible, it all added up. Gerald warned her repeatedly that they were burning through capital faster than they were making it back. "You need to see results soon," he told her during a particularly tense meeting in her office. "The investors who helped fund this are getting nervous. They believed in the story, in you, but belief doesn't pay the bills. We need black ink, Margaret, and we need it in the next quarter or this whole thing falls apart." Margaret knew he was right. She lay awake at night doing math in her head, trying to figure out how to increase revenue without compromising the principles that had brought her here in the first place. The pressure was enormous. She had put her own future on the line, but she'd also accepted money from hundreds of people who trusted her. If she failed, she wouldn't just lose everything herself. She'd be letting down everyone who had believed in her. It was during one of these sleepless nights that inspiration struck. The next morning, Margaret called an emergency meeting with her senior staff. Helen Rodriguez, Marcus, Jennifer, and 4 others gathered in the conference room, coffee cups in hand, uncertainty on their faces. "I have an idea," Margaret announced, "but it's going to require all of us to work harder than we've ever worked before. It's risky and it might not work, but I think it's our best shot at making this store not just survive, but thrive." She outlined her plan. A charity fashion show featuring clothes from Adelstein's, with proceeds going to scholarships for underprivileged students. They would invite every person and organization that had contributed to Margaret's purchase of the store. They would showcase not just the clothes, but the story, the transformation of Adelstein's from an exclusive boutique to an inclusive one. They would use real customers as models, people of all ages, sizes, and backgrounds. They would make it an event that celebrated diversity, dignity, and second chances. And, Margaret added, we'll invite the press. All of them. The ones who wrote negative stories about us. The ones who predicted our failure. Everyone. We'll show them exactly what Adelstein's has become. Helen leaned forward, excitement lighting up her face. "That's brilliant. It's not just a fundraiser, it's a statement. But can we pull it together in time? A proper fashion show takes months to plan." "We have 6 weeks," Margaret said. "I know it's crazy, but we don't have months. We need something big, something that generates buzz and brings people into the store. This is our shot." Jennifer spoke up, her voice tentative but enthusiastic. "I have a friend who's a fashion photographer. She's been looking for a big project. And my cousin works in event planning." "I know a caterer," Marcus added. "My sister. She's incredible, and she owes me a favor." One by one, the staff began contributing ideas, contacts, skills Margaret hadn't even known they possessed. By the end of the meeting, they had the skeleton of a plan and a list of tasks that seemed impossibly long, but just barely achievable. The next 6 weeks were the most intense of Margaret's life. She worked alongside her staff 18 hours a day, sometimes more. They reached out to everyone they could think of, calling in favors, making connections, building something from nothing. Sarah flew in to help, bringing James with her. Margaret's daughter turned out to have a gift for social media marketing, creating posts and videos that captured the spirit of what they were trying to do. James, who worked in graphic design, created invitations and promotional materials that were elegant without being pretentious. The models were the easiest part. Margaret put out a call to the new customers who had embraced Adelstein's transformation. The response was overwhelming. Women wrote letters about what the store meant to them, about how they'd never felt beautiful in high-end clothes before, about how Margaret's story had inspired them to believe they deserved nice things too. Margaret chose 20 models of different ages, sizes, and backgrounds. There was Aisha, the young professional, now successful and confident. There was Carmen, a grandmother in her 70s who had never worn anything designer in her life. There was Rachel, who used a wheelchair and had given up on fashion shows years ago because no one seemed to think disabled women deserved beautiful clothes. There was Michael, a transgender man who wrote Margaret a letter saying that her boutique was the first upscale store where he'd felt truly seen and respected. Rehearsals were chaotic, but joyful. The models weren't professionals, which meant they stumbled sometimes, laughed at their mistakes, and brought an authenticity to the process that no amount of professional polish could match. Margaret watched them support each other, celebrate each other's differences, and slowly transform into a cohesive group. 3 days before the show, Disaster struck. The venue they had booked, a hotel ballroom on Fifth Avenue, called to cancel. The manager apologized profusely, explaining that they'd received pressure from some of their high society clients who objected to what Adelsteins represented. They couldn't risk offending their regular customers. Margaret sat in her office, the phone still in her hand, feeling everything crumble around her. They had no venue. The show was in 3 days. Invitations had gone out. The press was expecting something. Without this event, without this opportunity to prove themselves, Adelsteins wouldn't survive another quarter. She put her head down on her desk and, for the first time since buying the store, allowed herself to cry. Not the angry tears of humiliation she'd shed in her car 2 months ago, but tears of exhaustion and despair. She had tried so hard. They all had. And it still wasn't enough. A soft knock on her door made her look up. Helen stood there, her face lined with concern. "I heard," Helen said simply. "The venue." Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. Helen sat down across from her. "May I tell you something, Ms. Washington? About my daughter?" Margaret wiped her eyes. "Of course. Maria is 30 now, beautiful, smart, successful. But when she was 16, she tried to take her own life." Helen's voice was steady, but Margaret could hear the old pain underneath. She was being bullied at school. They called her terrible names, made her feel worthless. "I almost lost her." "I'm so sorry," Margaret whispered. "She survived, got help, healed. But you know what she told me years later? She said that the worst part wasn't the bullying itself. It was feeling like no one would stand up for her, like the world had decided she didn't matter." Helen leaned forward. "You stood up, Ms. Washington. When you were humiliated, you didn't just survive it, you did something about it. You created a place where people like my Maria, people who have been told they don't matter, can walk in and be treated like they're valuable. Do you understand how rare that is? But if we don't have a venue..." "We have a venue," Helen interrupted. "We have the best venue possible. We use the store itself." Margaret blinked. "The store?" "Think about it. The marble floors, the crystal chandeliers, the space where all of this started. We can set up a runway right down the center aisle. We can have the models come down the same stairs where Patricia Chen used to stand and look down on everyone. We can transform the place that represented exclusion into a celebration of inclusion." Helen's eyes were bright with excitement. "It's perfect, Ms. Washington. It's poetic." Margaret sat up straighter, her mind racing. Helen was right. Using the store itself made a statement that no hotel ballroom ever could. This was where it had all begun. This was where it should be celebrated. "Helen Rodriguez," Margaret said, a smile spreading across her face despite her tears. "You're a genius." "I have my moments," Helen replied with a grin. "Now let's get to work. We have 3 days to turn a boutique into a fashion show venue." The night of the fashion show arrived with the kind of perfect spring weather that seemed almost too good to be true. The sun was setting over Fifth Avenue, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reflected off the boutique's windows like a promise. Margaret stood inside Adelstein's, looking at what her team had accomplished in just 3 days. The center aisle had been transformed into a runway, lined with chairs borrowed from a dozen different sources. The crystal chandeliers had been cleaned until they sparkled like diamonds. Flowers donated by a sympathetic florist filled every corner with color and fragrance. The marble floors gleamed. But more than the physical transformation, Margaret felt something else in the air. Anticipation, hope, the sense that something important was about to happen. The models were in the back, being helped into their outfits by staff members who had become friends over the past weeks. Margaret could hear laughter and nervous chatter, the sound of people supporting each other through their fears. Sarah was back there too, doing last-minute adjustments and offering encouragement. Gerald found Margaret standing at the entrance, watching the first guests arrive. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Terrified," Margaret admitted. "What if no one comes? What if the press tears us apart? What if—" "Look," Gerald interrupted, pointing toward the street. People were arriving. Not in ones and twos, but in crowds. Former students of Margaret's, some traveling from states away, members of the teachers' union wearing their colors proudly, representatives from civil rights organizations, the people who had donated to help buy the store, coming to see what their money had built. Regular customers, both old and new, curious to witness this moment. And yes, the press. Cameras and reporters lined up outside, some looking skeptical, others genuinely interested. Margaret spotted the fashion blogger who had written that scathing review, looking around with an expression that might have been grudging respect. "They came," Margaret whispered, feeling tears prick her eyes for what felt like the 100th time that week. "Of course they came," Gerald said gently. "This is your story, Margaret. But it's also their story. Everyone who's ever been made to feel like they don't belong, everyone who's been told they're not good enough, they're here to see that things can change." The boutique filled rapidly. Every seat was taken, with people standing along the walls and at the back. The energy in the room was electric, charged with expectation. Margaret saw faces of every age and color, people in designer suits sitting next to people in their Sunday best, wealth and modest means side by side in a way that Adelsteins had never seen before. Helen appeared at Margaret's elbow. "We're ready to start whenever you are." Margaret took a deep breath. This was it. The moment that would determine whether everything they'd worked for would survive or fail. She walked to the front of the runway, and the crowd quieted. "Thank you all for coming," Margaret began, her voice steady despite her nerves. 2 months ago, I walked into this store as a customer. I was treated with disrespect and discrimination. I was thrown out simply because of the color of my skin. I could have accepted that humiliation and moved on. But instead, with the help of many of you here tonight, I bought this store. Not for revenge, but for change. She paused, looking around at the faces watching her with rapt attention. Adelsteins has a long history. For decades, it represented the pinnacle of luxury retail in this city. But somewhere along the way, it forgot something important, that luxury should never come at the cost of human dignity. That exclusivity based on prejudice isn't elegance. It's just cruelty dressed up in expensive clothes. Margaret's voice grew stronger. Tonight, we're here to celebrate a new chapter for Adelsteins. We're here to show that a business can be both successful and ethical, that we can maintain the highest standards of quality and service while welcoming everyone through our doors. The proceeds from tonight's event will go to scholarships for underprivileged students because education, real education, is the foundation of lasting change. She gestured toward the runway. The models you're about to see aren't professionals. They're customers, real people who have embraced what Adelsteins has become. They represent the diversity of this city, this country, this world. They're beautiful, not despite their differences, but because of them. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the new Adelsteins. The lights dimmed. Music began to play, something classical but with a modern beat, traditional yet fresh. The first model appeared at the top of the stairs. It was Carmen, the 70-year-old grandmother, and she was absolutely radiant. She wore a deep blue evening gown that had been tailored perfectly to her body, moving with a grace that came not from youth but from confidence. As she descended the stairs and walked down the runway, the crowd erupted in applause. Carmen smiled, her eyes shining, and Margaret saw decades of being invisible, of being overlooked, fall away from her in that moment. One by one, the models appeared. Aisha in a sharp business suit that made her look like she could run the world. Rachel, using her wheelchair with such elegant control that it became not a limitation but part of her presence, wearing a gorgeous red dress that flowed around her like water. Michael standing tall and proud in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, tears streaming down his face as the audience cheered for him. Each model told a story. Each one represented someone who had been excluded, overlooked, or dismissed. And each one was beautiful, powerful, worthy of every bit of luxury that surrounded them. Margaret watched from the side, her heart so full she thought it might burst. This was what she had been fighting for. Not just a successful business, not just proving a point, but this, The joy on these people's faces, the message being sent that everyone deserved to feel beautiful, that dignity was not a privilege, but a right. The finale approached. All 20 models lined up for one last walk down the runway together, a rainbow of faces and bodies and stories. The applause was thunderous. People were standing, cheering, some crying openly. Cameras flashed everywhere as the press captured the moment. And then something happened that Margaret hadn't planned, hadn't even imagined. The models stopped at the end of the runway and turned to look at her. Carmen gestured for Margaret to join them. The crowd took up the invitation, chanting her name. "Margaret, Margaret, Margaret." Helen pushed her gently forward. "Go on, this is your moment too." Margaret walked onto the runway on trembling legs. The models surrounded her, these beautiful souls who had trusted her vision, and together they took a final bow. The applause seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. As Margaret stood there surrounded by love and acceptance and the evidence that change was possible, she thought about the woman she had been 2 months ago. That woman had been hurt, humiliated, made to feel small. But that woman had also been strong enough to turn pain into purpose, to transform her worst moment into something beautiful. The show ended, but the night was far from over. Guests mingled, examining the clothes, talking to the models, placing orders. The cash registers, both physical and online, kept ringing. The fashion blogger who had written the negative review approached Margaret with an expression of genuine remorse. "I was wrong," she said simply. "I wrote that political correctness was killing Adelsteins, but this isn't about political correctness, it's about basic human decency. You've created something special here, Ms. Washington. I'd like to write a follow-up piece if you'll let me, to correct the record." "I'd appreciate that," Margaret said, shaking her hand. More people approached. Former students hugged her, crying and laughing and telling her how proud they were. Representatives from the organizations that had donated asked how they could continue to support the store's mission. New customers placed orders for thousands of dollars worth of merchandise, saying they were honored to shop somewhere that reflected their values. Gerald appeared at her side with a champagne flute and a grin wider than Margaret had ever seen. "You should see the preliminary numbers. We made more tonight than we've made in any single day since you took over. And the online orders are still pouring in. Margaret, I think you just saved Adelsteins." Margaret clinked her glass against his, but her attention was drawn to the entrance. A woman stood there hesitating, looking uncomfortable and out of place. It took Margaret a moment to recognize her. Patricia Chen. The former manager looked older than she had 2 months ago, worn down by something Margaret couldn't quite identify. Their eyes met across the crowded boutique, and for a long moment, neither moved. Then Patricia walked forward slowly as if approaching something dangerous. She stopped a few feet from Margaret, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I shouldn't have come," Patricia said, her voice barely audible over the celebration around them. "I have no right to be here after what I did. But I needed to see this. I needed to see what you built." Margaret studied her former tormentor. She could send Patricia away, could refuse to even acknowledge her presence. She would have every right to do so. But as Margaret looked at this woman who had caused her so much pain, she realized something. Holding on to anger would only hurt herself. Patricia would have to live with her choices, with the knowledge of what she had done and what she had lost. That was punishment enough. "You're welcome to stay," Margaret said quietly. "Everyone is welcome here. That's the whole point." Patricia's face crumpled. "I lost everything. My job, my reputation. My daughter won't speak to me. She said she was ashamed of me." Tears rolled down her cheeks. "I was raised to believe certain things, to think the world worked a certain way. I thought I was protecting the store, maintaining standards, but I was wrong. So terribly wrong." "Yes, you were," Margaret agreed, not unkindly. "But the question is, what are you going to do about it?" "I don't know," Patricia whispered. "I don't know how to fix what I've broken." Margaret thought about Marcus, about the second chance she had given him and how he had transformed. She thought about her own journey from hurt to healing, from victim to victor. She thought about what she had learned, that everyone made mistakes, but not everyone had the courage to admit them and change. You start by acknowledging what you did was wrong, not just to me, but to everyone you turned away over the years, everyone you made feel less than human. Margaret's voice was firm but not harsh. Then you do better. You examine your biases, you challenge your assumptions, you treat every person you meet with dignity regardless of who they are or what they look like. It's not complicated, Patricia. It's just hard. Patricia nodded, wiping her eyes. Thank you for not just throwing me out. I could have, Margaret said. Part of me wanted to, but that would make me just like the person you used to be. I'm trying to be better than that. Patricia looked around the transformed boutique, at the diverse crowd celebrating, at the models still mingling in their beautiful clothes, at the evidence of everything Margaret had accomplished. You did something incredible here. You took your pain and turned it into something good. I took mine and... She shook her head. I have a lot of work to do. Then do it, Margaret said. And maybe someday you can come back here as a customer, a real customer, one who understands what this place stands for. Patricia managed a small, sad smile. Maybe someday. She turned to leave, then paused. For what it's worth, Ms. Washington, I'm sorry. Truly, deeply sorry. Margaret watched her leave, disappearing into the evening crowd on Fifth Avenue. She felt no satisfaction in Patricia's fall, no joy in her former enemy's obvious pain. But she felt something else. Peace. The circle was complete. The hurt had been acknowledged, the wrong had been confronted, and while justice had been served, mercy had been offered too. Sarah appeared, linking her arm through Margaret's. That was Patricia Chen, wasn't it? Yes. You didn't have to be kind to her. No, Margaret agreed. But I wanted to be. For me, not for her. Sarah hugged her mother tightly. I'm so proud of you, Mom. Not just for what you built here, but for who you are. Dad would be proud too. Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes at the mention of her late husband. I wish he could have seen this. He can, Sarah said softly. Wherever he is, he's watching. And he's amazed, just like I am. The celebration continued late into the night. As the last guests finally left and the staff began cleaning up, Margaret stood alone in the middle of the boutique, looking at what she had created. The runway would be disassembled tomorrow, the chairs returned, the flowers distributed to nursing homes and hospitals. But something fundamental had changed in this space, something that would remain long after the physical evidence of tonight was gone. Adelstein's was no longer just a store. It was a statement, a promise. A living example that change was possible, that dignity mattered more than tradition, that exclusion dressed up as exclusivity was just another word for bigotry. Helen found her there, holding 2 cups of coffee. Thought you might need this? Thank you, Margaret said, accepting the cup gratefully. Helen, I want you to know I couldn't have done any of this without you, without all of you. We needed you too, Helen replied. You gave us permission to be the people we always wanted to be, to work somewhere we could be proud of. That's a gift, Ms. Washington. Marcus approached, still in his security uniform but looking different somehow. Lighter, happier. Ms. Washington, I just wanted to say goodnight, and to thank you again. Tonight reminded me why I stayed, why I'm grateful for that second chance. You've more than earned it, Marcus, Margaret said warmly. I'm proud of you. After they left, Margaret locked the front door and turned off most of the lights, leaving only the chandeliers glowing softly in the darkness. She walked slowly through the store, running her fingers along the displays, remembering. She remembered the humiliation of being thrown out, the despair in her car afterward, the crazy, impossible decision to buy this place, the fear and uncertainty of the past 2 months, the joy of tonight's triumph. It had been the hardest thing she'd ever done. Harder than teaching for 37 years. Harder than raising Sarah alone. Harder than surviving her husband's death. But it had also been the most meaningful. She had taken her pain and transformed it into purpose. She had turned a place of exclusion into a space of welcome. She had proven that one person could make a difference if they were brave enough to try. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from Gerald. Final numbers are in. Tonight generated $287,000 in revenue, and we have online orders still coming in. You did it, Margaret. Adelstein's is going to make it. She smiled, tears of relief and gratitude rolling down her cheeks. They were going to make it. The store would survive. The vision would continue. The change would spread. But more than the financial success, more than saving the business, Margaret had won something else. She had reclaimed her dignity. She had proven to herself and to the world that she was not less than anyone else, that she belonged anywhere she chose to be, that no one had the right to make her feel small. The little girl from Mississippi who had grown up in the Jim Crow South, who had seen her parents humiliated and discriminated against, who had fought her whole life to be seen as equal. That little girl could rest now. She had fought her last battle and won. Margaret turned off the chandeliers and stepped out onto Fifth Avenue, locking the door behind her. The city stretched out around her, full of lights and life and infinite possibility. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new work to be done. There would be difficult decisions and hard days ahead, but tonight, standing in front of her store, with the spring breeze cool on her face and the taste of victory sweet on her tongue, Margaret Washington allowed herself to simply be happy. She had walked into Adelstein's 2 months ago as a customer who didn't belong. She had walked out as the owner who would make sure everyone belonged. And that, she thought as she headed toward her car, was the best revenge of all. Not revenge at all, but transformation. Not tearing down, but building up. Not exclusion, but embrace. The security guards had humiliated the black woman at the luxury store, but she had returned as the new owner, and she had changed everything. Margaret's story reminds us that change begins with one person who refuses to accept injustice. Her courage transformed not just a store, but the lives of everyone who walks through its doors. Have you ever witnessed discrimination? Have you ever been treated unfairly simply because of who you are? Margaret's journey shows us that we don't have to accept the world as it is. We have the power to change it. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Share it with someone who has ever felt invisible, unwelcome, or less than. Let them know that dignity is not a privilege, it's a right that belongs to everyone. And remember, you're never too old to stand up for what's right. You're never too old to make a difference. You're never too old to turn your pain into purpose. Margaret was 63 years old when she walked into that boutique. She was 63 when she was humiliated. And she was 63 when she decided to change everything. Age is just a number. Courage is timeless. What will your story be? Thank you for listening. May you always have the courage to stand up, speak out, and create the change you wish to see in the world.